Welcome to another World History class. And before any further ado, let us pause a prayer. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for this class. Thank you for the opportunity you have afforded us to do this course, to participate and to share in this course. I pray your blessings and protection upon the participants in this course, Lord. I also pray your protection and blessing upon myself. Pray your blessing, protection, and Lord, coverage upon the systems now engaged to make this course possible and this video possible. In the precious name I pray, amen. Praise the Lord. Without further ado, we are moving on. We're going to be looking at the transformation of material life. We have a far way to go, and we'll have to pick certain topics. I am trying to give as much as I possibly can, and in the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods, which of course lay the foundation for the superstructure of this course. Now, with the development of agriculture, that is out of the way now. We all know what is called the agricultural revolution. We have an understanding of that. And before such a revolution, people used to live like nomads, traveling from place to place, following the animals as they eat them off. They didn't have means to preserve meat, so much of the meat went to waste. And so on in those days, much of it went to waste. But the animals had a way to migrate, and they followed them because there was the ice bridge, the ice age. In the ice age, people could cross the oceans easily. There wasn't a problem in crossing the oceans when so long as the waterways were frozen and they could cross over, on solid bridges, ice bridges, and so on. So, agriculture has been born, is now born, and not everybody continues to roam the place. People started living sedentary life. Humans began to transform more and more extensively the environment in which they lived. They were transforming and they were impacting the environment to transform. A growing portion of humans became sedentary farmers who cleared lands around their settlements and controlled the plants that grew and the animals that grazed on them. The greater presence of humans was also apparent in the steadily growing size and numbers of settlements. These were found both in areas that humans had long inhabited and in new regions that farming allowed them to settle. This great increase in the number of sedentary farmers is primarily responsible for the leap in human population during the Neolithic Age. We are now in the Neolithic Age. For tens of thousands of years before agriculture was developed, the total number of humans had fluctuated between an estimated 5 and 8 million. It's amazing how different authorities give different statistics on human population. Because I have statistics from a certain university where the professor said when Jesus was here on earth, the population worldwide was 1 million. And he gave statistics step by step of the increase, or the population increase and move on, It's really amazing. They don't really agree because a lot of it is guesstimates, and how they arrive at these guesstimates, I don't know. It's not very accurate. They don't all agree. So it is said that the total number of humans had fluctuated between an estimated 5 and 8 million. By 4000 BCE, after 4 or 5 millennia of farming, their numbers had risen to 60 or 70 million. So this, I tend to want to agree with the statistics over the other statistics of demography. This kind of look more realistic. They sound more realistic. Hunting and gathering bands managed to subsist in the zones between cultivated areas and continued to fight and trade sedentary peoples. But villages and cultivated fields became the dominant features of human habitation over much of the globe. The sudden surge in invention and social complexity in the Neolithic Age marks one of the great turning points in human history. Increased reliance on sedentary cultivation led to the development of a wide variety of agricultural tools, such as digging sticks used to break up the soil, axes to clear forested areas, and the plow. Seed selection, planting, fertilization, and weeding techniques improved steadily. All these improved because people they were faced with challenges, and ideas came to them how to overcome those challenges. And challenges, become the mother of invention. By the end of the Neolithic Age, human societies in several areas had devised ways to store rainwater and re-channel river water to irrigate plants. Mhm. The reservoirs, canals, dikes, and sluices that permitted water storage that represented represented another major advance in humans' ability to remake their environment. Mhm. More and better tools and permanent settlements gave rise to larger, more elaborate housing and community ritual centers. Houses usually were uniform in construction. Most of the early ones contained the features depicted through this book, which shows an archaeological reconstruction of a dwelling from the Neolithic Age. Building materials varied greatly by region, but sun-dried bricks, wattle, interwoven branches, usually plastered with mud, and stone structures were associated with early agricultural communities. Seasonal harvests made improved techniques of food storage essential. At first, baskets and leather containers were used, but already in the early Neolithic Age, pottery, which protected stored foods better from moisture and dust, was known to several cultures. In the Middle East, mhm, there were, humans were faced with challenges, and they were creating ways and means of dealing with the challenges to overcome the challenges. They had challenges, and they continue to create They just they just didn't give in. The social, the surplus production that agriculture and made possible was a key to the social transformations that made up another dimension of the Neolithic revolution, surplus production. Surpluses meant that farmers could exchange part of their harvest for the specialized services and products of craftspeople, such as tool makers and weavers. Human communities became differentiated by occupations. Full-time political and religious leaders emerged and eventually formed elite classes because they had to command respect and obedience. So, um, you find that over time they were somewhat separated because if the political leader could not command the respect and obedience of the community, then it served no useful purpose. And then he had to have people who would help to enforce his authority, which gave him even greater authority and put him in a position to make demands. Support, you'd have to support him, and things like that, work and support him. So he and his family would become an elite group, and those who advised him and so on. Originally, each household crafted the tools and weapons it needed, just as it wove its own baskets and produced its own clothing. Over time, however, families or individuals who proved particularly skilled in these tasks began to manufacture implements beyond their own needs and to exchange them for grain, milk, or meat. Villages in certain regions specialized in producing materials that were in demand in other areas. For example, flint, which is extremely hard, was the preferred material for axe blades. Flint, extremely hard. Axes were needed for forest clearing, which was essential to the extension of cultivation in much of Europe. The demand was so great that villagers who lived near flint deposits could support themselves by mining the flint or crafting the flint heads and trading often with peoples who lived far from the sources of production and may not even have the skill to do so. Such exchanges set precedents for regional specialization and inter-regional trade. It is difficult to know precisely what impact the shift to agriculture had on the social structure of the communities that made the transition. Social distinctions probably were heightened by occupational differences, but well-defined social stratification, such as that which produces class identity, was non-existent. Leadership remained largely communal, although village alliances may have existed in some areas. It is likely that property in Neolithic times was held in common by the community, or at least that all households in the community were given access to village lands and water. By virtue of their key roles as food gatherers in pre-farming cultures, it can be surmised that women played a critical part in the domestication of plants. Nonetheless, there is evidence that their position declined in many agricultural communities. They worked the fields and have continued to work them in most cultures, but men took over tasks involving heavy labor, such as clearing land, hoeing, and plowing. Men monopolized in new tools and weapons devised in the Neolithic Age and later times, and they control the vital irrigation systems that developed in most early centers of agriculture. As far as we can tell, men also took the lead in taming, breeding, and raising the large animals associated with both farming and pastoral communities. Thus, although Neolithic art suggests that earth and fertility cults, which focus on feminine deities, retain their appeal, the social and economic position of women may have begun to decline with the shift to sedentary agriculture. The earliest writing system we know of was not introduced until around 3500 BCE in the civilization of Sumer in Mesopotamia. And I wanted to mark that. We have gotten a very important date here. So, as you notice, it says the earliest writing system we know of was introduced somewhere about 3500 BCE in Sumer in Mesopotamia. And it is believed that Sumer was the first city to have been built on planet Earth. Consequently, evidence for piecing together the history of human life in the Paleolithic and Neolithic ages comes mainly from surviving artifacts from campsites and early towns. So, right, you have to piece the bits and pieces and relics that they have gathered. And archaeologists go in search of these things and they date them, well, date the finding when they make the finds and put them in the archives. Historians now go to the archives. They don't really go to the fields as such. They're not archaeologists, and they get information and they sit down and they do the piecing. Stone tools, bits of pottery or cloth, and the remains of Stone Age dwellings can now be dated rather precisely. When combined with other objects from the same site and time period, they give us a fairly good sense of the daily activities and life cycle of the peoples who created them. As we have seen in the document on cave paintings of all the material remains of the Stone Age era, none provide better insight into the social organization and thinking of early humans than works of art. And writing started out as a work of art. In fact, it started out as what is known as hieroglyphics. So it was really a work of art, but it grew. Much of what we know about gender relations or the status of males and females and the interaction between them has been interpreted from the study of the different forms of artistic expression of Stone Age peoples. The stone carvings and figurines reproduced here illustrate themes and impressions of women and their roles. Some of the earliest rock carvings, such as the Venus of Losel, shown depict robust pregnant women. Mhm. Mhm. Robust pregnant women. And so on. They believe that there are fundamental differences between civilized and barbaric or savage peoples. It's very ancient and widespread. For thousands of years, the Chinese set themselves off from cattle and sheep herding peoples of the vast plains to the north and west of China proper, whom they saw as barbarians. To the, to the Chinese, being civilized was cultural, not biological or racial. I agree with that. Civilization has to do with culture. It's not biological. If barbarians learned the Chinese language and adopted Chinese ways, from the clothes they wore to the food they ate, they were regarded as civilized. A similar pattern of demarcation and culture and cultural absorption was found among the American Indian peoples of present-day Mexico. Those who settled in the valleys of the mountainous interior, where they built great civilizations, lived in fear of invasions by peoples they regarded as barbarians or barbarous, and called Chichimecs, meaning sons of the dogs, the Chichimecs. The latter were nomadic hunters and gatherers who periodically moved down from the desert regions of North Mexico into the fertile central valleys in search of game and settlements to pillage. The Aztecs were simply the last and perhaps the most fierce of a long line of Chichimec peoples who entered the valleys and conquered the urban-based empires that had developed there. But after the conquerors settled down, they adopted many of the religious beliefs and institutional patterns and much of the material culture of defeated peoples. They might have enslaved them too. And no doubt miscegenation developed too, because although they look down at you and so on, and seek to conquer you and rule over you, they could not resist the appeal of the females. So miscegenation developed. The word civilization is derived from the Latin word civilis, meaning of citizens. So the Latin word civilis means citizens. The term was coined by the Romans. They used it to distinguish between themselves as citizens of a cosmopolitan, urban-based civilization and the inferior peoples who lived in the forest and desert and the fringes of their Mediterranean empire. Centuries earlier, the Greeks, who had contributed much to the rise of Roman civilization, made a similar distinction between themselves and outsiders, because the languages of the non-Greek peoples to the north of the Greek heartlands sounded like senseless babble to the Greeks. They lumped all the outsiders together as barbarians, which meant those who cannot speak Greek. That was the meaning of it. Couldn't speak Greek. Which again is sort of selfish, because Greek, that means they regarded the Greek language, as the supreme language on planet Earth. I can understand the Chinese meaning of culture and civilized. They didn't think it was biological. If you were a barbarian, if they regarded you as a barbarian, it was not from a biological perspective, but from a cultural, the way you live, your lifestyle, and by and large, that's what determines culture. How a person laughs, how he talks, his grammar, his mode of dress, his tastes, his choices of music and arts and education and so on. Those remain. I mean, that's what that is common. That's what obtains now. As in the case of the Chinese and Aztecs, The boundaries between civilized and barbarian for the Greeks and Romans were cultural. Regardless of the color of one's skin or the shape of one's nose, it was possible for free people to become members of a Greek polis city-state or to become Roman citizens by adopting Greek or Roman customs and swearing allegiance to the polis or the emperor. In the case of the Greek, it would be the polis, which is the city-state. In the case of the Romans, it would be the emperor. Until the 17th and 18th centuries CE, the priority given to cultural attributes, example language, dress, manners, as a means by which civilized people set themselves off from barbaric ones, was rarely challenged. But in those centuries, two major changes occurred among thinkers in Western Europe. First, efforts were made not only to define the differences between civilized and barbarian, but to identify a series of stages in human development that range from the lowest savagery to the highest civilization. Depending on the writer in question, candidates for civilization range from Greece and Rome to Europe of the 17th and 18th centuries. Most of the other peoples of the globe whose discovery since the 15th century had prompted the efforts to classify them in the first place were ranked in increasingly complex hierarchies. People such as the Chinese and the Arabs, who had created great cities, monumental architecture, writing, advanced technology, and large empires, usually won a place along with the Europeans near the top of these ladders of human achievements. Nomadic cattle and sheep herding peoples, such as the Mongols of Central Asia, usually were classified as barbarians. Civilized and barbarian peoples were pitted against various sorts of savages. These ranged from the hunters and gatherers who inhabited much of North America and Australia to many peoples in Africa and Asia whom the Europeans believed had not advanced beyond the most primitive stages of social and political developments. Praise the Lord. The second major shift in Western ideas about civilization began at the end of the 18th century, but did not really take hold until the century later. In keeping with a growing emphasis in European thinking and social interaction and racial or biological differences, modes of human social organization and cultural expression were increasingly linked to what were alleged to be the innate capacities of each human race. Although no one could agree on what a race was or how many races there were, most European writers argue that some races were more inventive, moral, courageous, and artistic, thus more capable of building civilizations than others, which is nonsense. Of course, white or Caucasian Europeans were considered by white European authors to be the most capable of all. Nonsense again. The hierarchy from savage to civilized took on a color dimension, with white at the top, where the civilized peoples clustered, to yellow, red, brown, and black in descending order. And whenever time those Europeans and those who had those ideas happened to have the technology and means to oppress those who were not white, they would see to it that people were treated accordingly. That's exactly what happened in India when they were conquered by Indo-European, this Indo-European group, and they were Caucasians, and they imposed the class system. We say class, we could say caste, same thing, CASTE, system in India. So those who were black or of dark complexion were relegated to the position of servitude, and they became known as the Untouchables. And they were not to be given education. Their lot was to bury dead, dig graves, and do the dirty work and clean places and so on. And the Brahman, they were the top. They were high complexion people. And there are about 5 castes, different castes. But Brahman at the top. I am not, we'll come to it, so let me not go into it too deeply. But that is how, and when they came to the Caribbean, when the European groups and nations dominated the Caribbean, that was what they instituted too in the New World. And that's what they instituted in the Americas as a whole, among the Indians, and relegated them to a position of servitude. They did not regard them as human beings, so they were not treated properly, and they died like flies overnight. Then now, the need for workers arose, and they started importing African workers. They were treated in like manner, but they were tougher and were better able to withstand the cruel treatment. Many died too. Many died also. But the Europeans are known for that. Some authors sought to reserve all the attainments of civilization for whites or peoples of European stock, which is wrong. As the evolutionary theories of thinkers such as Charles Darwin came into vogue in the late 1800s, race and level of culture development were seen in the perspective of thousands of years of human change and adaptation rather than as being fixed in time. Nevertheless, this new perspective had little effect on the rankings of different human groups. Civilized whites were simply seen as having evolved much further than backward and barbaric peoples. But I don't think you can really avoid classism. What is not good is when they make it biological. And and so on. Because you're black, you're necessarily uncivilized. And because you don't speak their language, not because you don't have a language, but because you don't speak the language of, say, the Chinese or Greek or English or French, you're necessarily uncivilized. I have a problem with that. They did have a problem with races. Now, I have met with this black professor, Runuko Rashidi, and you can Google it, his name, and he dismisses the theory or idea or thought of races, and I agree with him. I believe there is just one race of people. That's what he said, and I agree, one race, and that is the human race. Yes, there are differences in our complexion and facial features and hair and so on. Those are due to ethnic differentiations and differences. We have ethnic groups. So the Chinese would constitute an ethnic group. The Africans, or the blacks, would constitute an ethnic group. The Indians would constitute a different ethnic group, and there are subgroups to these these major groupings and so on. But one race, that is the human race. I agree with him. The, the perceived correspondence between race and level of development and the hardening of the boundaries between civilized and inferior peoples affected much more than intellectual discourse about the nature and history of human society. These beliefs were used to justify European imperialist expansion, which was seen as a civilizing mission aimed at uplifting barbaric and savage peoples across the globe, and that was the wickedness that was perpetrated. In the last half of the 19th century, virtually all non-Western peoples came to be dominated by the Europeans, who were confident that they, as representatives of the highest civilization ever created, were best equipped to govern lesser breeds of humans. That is wickedness. That is wrong. And hence we see the barbarity that was meted out to people across the globe. And in some instances, some of these ethnic groups have been wiped out. And where they were not wiped out, they were seriously decimated. Do your reflection and email me. God bless you.